All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this month's Soils Network of Knowledge webinar with Simon Eldridge. I'm Abigail Jenkins, one of two Soil Development Officers with New South Wales DPI, and we have another whose name is Luke Benj. He's also online today. Let's get on to what we're here for. I'd like to introduce Simon Eldridge, who's a research fellow from Melbourne University, but was previously with New South Wales DPI. Currently, Simon's working on nutrient management in rice and maize agricultural systems in Myanmar, but before this, he spent over a decade with New South Wales DPI, as I said, researching the beneficial use of recycled organics in agriculture at the CROA, what we call the CROA site in Western Sydney, which is a DPI research site. And as part of this, he worked as a member of a team of scientists looking at a compost vegetable trial, which was established in 2005 and was led at that point by Dr. Yin Chan. And Simon took over the management of that long-term compost trial in 2010 until its completion in 2013. And this is what he's going to talk to us about today.
Thanks very much, Abigail. I was just going to talk today about, I guess, the value of compost in peri-urban vegetable production systems, and go through a lot of the work that went on at CROA that was started by Yin Chan back then in 2005, and try and I guess think about some implications for further research as well. So I'll I'll just briefly go over I guess the situation, recycled organic compost from recycled organics in Australia, the benefits and risks, talk about the long-term compost field vegetable field trial at CROA, benefits for soil quality, the yield results we got, and talk about capsicum as I guess a classic example of closing the yield gap that came from this work. We'll talk about the sustainability of this system, and then go on to future work and things we could take from this experiment, and look at for further research. So I was told to do general conclusions at the beginning, just in case I drag on too long. So I guess some of the things to come from this talk will be, the fertilizer value of composts with the, NPK and micronutrients they contain, and of course the high organic carbon content associated with them, and the improvements in soil quality we get with that. And from that, benefits for the soil chemistry, the cation exchange capacity, pH buffering capacity, and so, the ability of the soil to hold nutrients, and the lower need for lime, etc. Improved infiltration and aggregate stability and porosity, water holding capacity for sandy soils, for example. Improvements in soil biology, and looking at microbial biomass increases, and increased nutrient cycling, and diversity and pathogen suppression, and yield benefits for some crops that are responsive. Also briefly mention the sort of risks that you have to manage in terms of, potential contaminants and things that can be in composts, and choosing a low contaminant compost example. Look at the, I guess, the economics of the whole story, and how important distance from the supply is in terms of the cost of the compost, and the importance of having a system that has high value crops that give a yield response to pay for the investment. Looking at recycled organics, the whole thing about recycling back into food production, and at least sort of minimising loss of some nutrients like phosphorus, example, and improving soil quality and food security. So obviously, as we all know, I guess the drivers for the changes in Australia were in terms of, you know, the cost of landfill and how we started with the bringing of green first, you know, green lid bins that were brought into our domestic situation, and with garden organics that started, and more recently, and some places are a bit ahead. For example, up around Lismore, the inclusion of food waste from household food waste into that green bin for composting, and that's will start to happen everywhere, I guess, over time, as part of this strategy, national food waste strategy. Obviously, with the economics, as I said before, the fact that they're bulky, heavy products means that transport costs have a big influence there. Just for I guess, as a try to explain the reasons for starting up the field trial originally in 2005 was this picture here, where with the green waste bins and you know, a lot of green waste being collected from households, they were getting mountains of it, making lots of compost, but I guess most of that was going into what you'd say the urban landscaping sort of sector of the market, but that was thought to be almost saturated, and they looked at agriculture, and there's only about 20% was going into agriculture, if that. And so trying to look at I guess get some knowledge base to try and push for penetrating that market for the recycled organic wastes and composting, etc. So this was a standard green waste bin, and you know, that source separated product, and producing a compost that's you know, Australian standard at least. And we've had some other experiments going on, which is the solid mixed waste thing, particularly in Sydney, and I think that was a bit of a problem in terms of you've already got your contaminants mixed in there. It's hard to get them out. So they're trying to work through the mountains they've created there, I guess, sprinkling higher contaminant levels around the landscape. But from this, probably some technologies for removing plastics and glass and stuff from may be beneficial for the source separated green waste compost for the future. So it's maybe some lessons learnt. We're moving towards this sort of setup where you put your household waste into like a starch plastic bag, compostable bags. This occurs sort of in some areas, such as around sort of Lismore on the north coast of New South Wales, and Ballina up that way, and it's going to be promoted in other areas. So as well as promoting people to do their own composting in their backyard for that sort of waste, they'll also be promoting this as an option. And I guess the reason is a reduction in greenhouse, is a reduction in in volume. I guess they represent for landfill and cost that way, but a side benefit is a reduction in green waste gases from less methane emissions, etc. So this is just a soil organic waste incubation. A study I did a while ago. It's published in Geoderma, some of it, but just to show you different mineral nitrogen supplies from different composts. This is the mixed solid waste compost, which has that food waste. And so this is saying that about 25% of that was available over a year from that compost, compared to, say, a nitrohumus, which is a green waste with some biosolids in it, was around 12%. And the green waste compost, which is fairly lean green waste compost, it actually had a bit of nitrogen immobilisation occurring in the incubation study, but in a sandier soil it produced about 10% as well. So that's interesting when you're looking at different composts, something to take into account. All right, so I guess briefly just a summary of the benefits to soils and the environment, which most people are aware of, is obviously there's a fertiliser value, but the big thing is the organic carbon impact. So in terms of soil biology, you're providing an energy source for the soil biota, and increased microbial biomass and diversity and sort of function often follows. And with that, there's evidence of increased disease suppression for certain plant pathogens. You're getting better cycling of nutrients, and with microbial function and also nitrogen cycling of inorganic fertilizers as well, because there's some microbial, consumption and as part of the process. And from that, reduce greenhouse gas effects, emission effects. Soil chemistry increased cation exchange capacity of soil to hold nutrients, and improve soil structure, with structural stability and aggregates in the soil, so better infiltration and better easier for roots to explore the soil and get in contact with the water and nutrients they need. The other things is to note, I guess, is that the same sort of potential risks exist with using these products as any other in terms of, the environment and runoff, and so you have to take note of the nutrient levels of your soil and what's in the product as well. Also, there's contaminants that can be, that can accumulate in these sort of waste. There's these composts which have the inputs are from the green waste, etc., and various contaminants can come in from there, and manures that go with it. So that's something to be looked for, and plastics, and so there's all those things to manage that are part of the picture. There's the Australian standard helps maintain at least a low contaminant, heavy metal and pesticides and things. There's still some plastics and glass there. So there's an option for more premium, I guess, standards to be developed that have less glass and plastic. So that's an issue for the future, and how you decide what to do with these wastes, whether you turn them into compost or perhaps think of biochar if there's too much plastic, for example. The long-term compost trial we had was, as I said, was started by Yin Chan, and in 2005 and continued on for about 10 or more than 10 crops, but we'll talk about 10 crops today. I think just general things about spreading compost is of course the importance of incorporating it quickly so you reduce your ammonium volatilization losses to the atmosphere. And usually we incorporate it, a month or so before planting, similar to what you might do for a manure in these setups, in these systems. Salt can be an issue for early crops, so lettuce and stuff like that. You probably would wait. You wouldn't have that as your first crop following a big application. And so there's some other things. So the experiment itself, we basically had 7 treatments and 4 reps in 4 blocks. We had a control with nothing, nil inputs. We had a large compost application as a one-off, followed by 5 crops. So this is 125 tonnes per hectare, and that was the nitrogen requirement, I guess, for the first crop, assuming a 10% mineralisation or supply of nitrogen from the nitrogen in the compost. The mixed treatment was half that rate, plus inorganic fertilisers, NPK and urea were the same as well. Then we had farmer practice, which was it had half its NPK as inorganic fertilisers, so the same as what the mix got, but it also had half as chicken manure. And we had a high P and low P version of all of these treatments to look at that effect, I suppose. So we had 1 compost applications before the first crop, then 5 crops, then a repeat of that compost application, then another 5 crops in this system. The composts themselves, they were similar in some respects in terms of, I guess the second one was a bit different in terms of it had a higher extractable coal oil P, so available P. So that was related to a higher chicken manure. So I guess we didn't really know that till we got it, and then so that was something to take note in the study anyway, and something to look out for too when you're managing these things. So similar in most other respects in carbon nitrogen ratio, but a higher P, available P content. Chicken manure is the fairly standard. They've always got a lot of available P and so forth, and a lot of the nitrogen is ammonium. This was to show I guess, a fairly sort of standard lean green waste compost, which was that you might get more in terms of, while the compost we had were sort of like a blended compost, so 10% manure, 10 to 20% manure in this case, I think, and the rest green waste. The crops, we had 10 crops. We had broccoli, eggplant, cabbage, capsicum, leek for the first lot, then another application of compost, then we had capsicum first up. And so the capsicum will be a story we'll talk about later, in that the first one was 4 crops after the first application. The second was the second capsicum, crop 6, was directly after the second application of compost. Soil carbon levels over time, we see here we have total carbon in the soil, top 15 centimetres, and the crop sequence 1 to 10 in this case. The red is the compost treatment, 125 tonnes per hectare. Then the mixed treatment, mixed compost, half compost rate. Then the conventional farmer practice. And so you can see that obviously the big boost in carbon you get taking it from, this is a control with nothing, from about 1 up to 2.2 or so. And then over time it drops with tillage over time, and then the second application brought it back up to around 3%. And that's when we had our capsicum crop. And then tillage, because it's a rotary hose system, really knocked it back down to about 2% over 5 crops. So you see that sort of going on. And similar for the half rate, just, you know, lower levels, while the conventional sort of holds its own, slightly increasing, I suppose. So that's the chicken manure, I guess, and residues going in. So all of these are receiving residues over time as well. So it sort of shows maybe the chicken manure one is fairly stable, but the others get a real boost and then gradually decline with tillage over time. So so I guess the loss was about 40% for the first lot, and then the second application of compost we lost the carbon a bit more rapidly, 2/3 lost in that 5 crops. So with that, of course, we had properties such as soil cation exchange capacity, the capacity of soil to hold cation sort of nutrients, soil structure over here. This is water stable aggregates, so the percentage of soil aggregates that are stable in water as to assessment there. And this is the crop sequence. This is crop 6 following the second application of compost through to crop 10. So you can see it really boosts that the stability of the soil aggregates, but it declines over time as organic carbon declines in the system. And similar with the mixed and the farmer practice, but from a lower level. But you see that benefit there from that. Try again. All right, this was looking at the effect of compost on infiltration and water quality. And if you look here, you can see the compost and mixed are the 2 Bs there, basically, these 2 bigger ones. So you can see, and then the farmer practice is the 2 As here. So you can see that the infiltration is higher, has been increased with the compost. So you got higher infiltration, less runoff, and the farmer practice is, you know, obviously lower. And yeah, it's just mirrored in the runoff there. And then that follows through in terms of the nutrient levels as well. So there was the farmer practice had much higher levels of phosphorus in the runoff because of the higher levels in the soil, and there was more runoff. Other effects, we looked at soil. We're looking at here. We're looking at soil strength. So we have the soil. So the depth from the surface here of the soil down to 550 centimetres, and this is the strength of the soil. So it's getting stronger and stronger as you go out here. And here we have the the nil control, then we have farmer practice, then we have the half rate of compost and the full rate of compost. So you see the compost has made the soil, it's made it much easier, much less strong, I suppose. The others have been more resistant to pushing a soil penetrometer through the soil. So it's much harder here and softer here, so the plant roots can explore the soil and get better access to nutrients and water as part of this compost system. Over here, we're looking at just increased water holding capacity, and these treatments down here are the more organic sort of treatments, and this is like the DPI standard farmer practice, and this is field capacity, moisture content, and it's just showing you that you've got a higher storage capacity for water in the compost treatments compared to conventional. So with the compost, this is in a sandy soil, and it's more a sandy soil phenomena. Once you get into a heavier sort of clay loam sort of soils, the effect isn't as obvious, but in sandy soils it's very important, that water holding capacity. Soil biology, we looked at that as well over the crops, and here we're looking at microbial biomass carbon, and so the carbon in the soil microbes. And the main thing is that if you look here, you can see, for example, this is the CGO is this high one here, and then we have, say, farmer practice for the low P is here. So it's just showing you that there's a significant increase in microbial biomass and soil microbes, and what I guess, and it doesn't really matter the size of these because they vary over time, but it's the difference between compost and the other treatments, farmer practice. So it's significantly higher. And I think what we found as well was that the significant difference in the compost treatment versus farmer practice lasted longer following the second application of compost. So it was almost as if there was some priming effect, putting a big load of compost into the system in the soil biology, and then when you applied later applications later, there was more response. Yep. And disease, other things were, things like there were significant differences in nematode populations, and things like, I guess, biolog measurements, looking at the breakdown of various substrates, so microbial activity, and I think Nerida Donovan and them at EMAI there have a lot of data they still have to publish, but there's some good information there. And also disease suppression, there's a lot of publications on that from compost, and I think they've done a bit of work at Camden as well in DPI, associated with this trial. So enzyme activity, again, cycling of nutrients and so forth. So crop results was the other thing, I guess, for this field trial. Of course, that's very important. That's what the name of the game is, all about trying to stay in the red. So matching. So what the results really showed was over 10 crops is that the compost treatments, they matched farmer practice in terms of yield, meaning they were no less for all crops. And some crops were significantly higher, and these were capsicum, seemed to respond well to the increased soil quality. So it was 35% higher for the crop 4. That was after the first application of compost. And then when we applied the second application of compost and put the crop in straight after, we had a very big yield, 90% higher yield than compared to farmer practice. And the other crop was lettuce, was higher after the second application. So it's this, I guess it's this dramatic response to the compost treatment for capsicum, which is very interesting because it's a classic example of closing the yield gap by improving soil quality for a crop. So here I think the average sort of yield for Eastern Australia was reported to be around sort of 50, this is marketable yield here, fresh weight. This is farmer practice, compost treatment, mixed and control, and you'll see well, all the treatments were above average yield really, but comparing farmer practice to the compost for these crop 6 was it's almost double, 90% higher. And also the mix treatment, the half compost, also responded well. So it showed a second application of that 60 tonnes per hectare rate really had an influence there on yield. So this is another graph of that. And here we have crop 4 as the white bar, and the darker bar is the crop 6, the later capsicum straight after the compost. But so farmer practice didn't change much between those two. The compost treatment was a much higher yield after the second application of compost here, and the mix was, it was not much different to farm and practice for the first one, crop 4, but for the second one, after the second application compost, it was, not far off. In fact, not significantly different to the top rate. So that showed benefit there. And this is just the high phosphorus version, which is showing us a similar trend again. So the high phosphorus soil levels. So it's an example of closing a yield gap by increasing soil quality with compost, overcoming constraints of a hard-setting soil in this case. The other interesting thing here is a table which looks at why there is that increase in yield, and it breaks it down to I guess the reason for it. If you look here, you can see it's to do with the number of fruit per plant that was achieved. And here the compost treatment is a significantly higher number of fruit per plant as it works out, compared to the farmer practice. And also, well, the mix isn't as significant here, but over here for the it is for the low phosphorus version, so one of the versions was. But so if you look here, you can see 48% of the possible fruit for a plant that you could have achieved, 48% was achieved by farm practice, but the compost increased that to almost 84% of the fruit, reaching a marketable quality per plant. So that's where the benefit has come through. And the other interesting thing is the soil organic carbon, which is getting back to the reasons for all of this. It's quite interesting. This is the total organic carbon at crop 6. This is after the second application of compost. And over here, we're looking at the total organic carbon crop 4 after the first application. But this is the capsicum crop as crop 4. Here we have farmer practice compost mix. And if you look here, you can see the compost treatment for that where you had the big response. It was 3% for the compost here, 3% organic carbon. The mix was 2.3%, and the farm practice was only 1.4%. When we go back to crop 4, we can see that the mix was 1.6%, and the farmer practice was also very similar, and so there was no difference there then. But the compost treatment at 2.1% had about a 25% higher yield. So once the mix had been pushed up to 2.3%, it was getting a yield response equivalent to the full compost, so the half rate. So it just shows you that in this system, maybe keeping it above about 2% for capsicum at least explains some of that response. So I was just putting this as a sort of a classic case study, really, of improving, bridging the yield gap with improved soil quality by organic inputs into the system. And this is one strategy put forward by Lau as a way of increasing food production, I suppose. And it's one of the strategies that we need to explore, and it's a matter of sort of finding, obviously responsive crops to these inputs, to soil quality improvements. So other aspects of this experiment that were that came out were savings from the compost treatment in terms of we used 55% less urea the farmer practice over the 10 crops. And this involved, because how we used the urea was basically using a SAP test compared to farmer practice. So if there was a comparable level of nitrogen, nitrate, or in the sap of the vegetable sample, we would not apply any urea nitrogen. But if it was lower, substantially lower, we would apply urea. So what happened was we found that for the first 2 crops following the large application of compost, we didn't need any urea, and that's also incorporating residues and so forth as well. And then after the second application of compost, it was we went for 3 crops before we needed to add urea. And so there was a even better saving there. And for the compost, of course, there's no P and K required. So they're savings that we were achieving. And I think monitoring nitrogen is very important with compost, and having the option of using inorganic nitrogen is pretty important to overcome problems. Economic benefits, cost analysis. So I guess the other aspect of the capsicum crop is that it was a very high value crop. So it had implications for the economics of the whole system. So we did a benefit cost analysis on the 10 crops. And it was just done by the economic section of DPI. And we found that for the first, after the first application of compost, crops 1 to 5, the economics showed that for the large compost application, the compost treatment, it was around 1. So a BCR, benefit cost ratio, about 1 means you break even. So you get $1 back for every $1 you invested in compost. But when you looked at the whole system over 10 crops with that substantial yield benefit for capsicum, that brought that up to around 3.3, meaning you're getting over $3 for every dollar you had invested in those compost. So it meant that it was economical in this system, provided you chose the right, I guess, those crops is part of the story, and the order of planting and so forth. So, but at least it showed that aspect of it. When you looked at the mixed treatment, for example, it was for the first 60-ton application and 5 crops. It was sort of uneconomic, I suppose, for that period of time, and so you weren't getting your money back. But over the 10 crops, when you applied a second application of 60 tonnes per hectare, you got that response once you got that carbon level up to around 2%, and that's where it was also, comparable to the full compost rate in terms of economics. So obviously the capsicum yield response has a dominant influence on this analysis, and the importance of a high value crop that's responsive is there, and also in this analysis it's taken into account the benefits from inorganic fertilizer savings and liming, which was required for the 10th crop, which was maize, for the treatments other than compost, while the compost had a higher buffering capacity and it didn't decline in pH the same. So I was just going to say, for the economics of compost, things we need to look at are is that the agricultural enterprise you're looking at really has to be sort of close to the compost source, just because of the sheer cost of transport of these bulky materials, and that's just a fact of life with these things. The further you get away from where the compost is, the more expensive it is, and therefore the higher return you need to cover your costs. So in some ways that shows the suitability of a peri-urban sort of agriculture system, because it's close to the source where all the organics is accumulating. Another aspect is the need for a high value crop with yield response to improve soil quality, because you need a yield response, but you also need a high value crop to make that increase in income to cover the costs of the investment. So obviously things like vegetables and fruit and all these other horticultural crops it's very worthwhile, but if it was, for example, a pasture or something, it might be hard to recoup the cost, the value. So the sustainability of this system, now that's an another interesting issue, because going on those results, you'd think, oh, you'd be throwing on tons of the stuff and to make a fortune. But there's other aspects that we need to consider, of course. And one of the things with this study was that we stuck to a fairly we stuck fairly strictly to the guideline applications for fertilizers, in some ways just to see what would happen as a system over time. And if you look at these, we're looking at soil phosphorus levels. So the blue one here is the farmer practice, which is using chicken manure, and then inorganic, half chicken manure, half inorganic fertilizers for each crop over time. And you can see the soil phosphorus levels are gradually rising from the beginning, where it was only about 30 milligrams per kilogram of coal P, that's plant, I guess, extractable P, like plant available, and it's increased over time with each crop, and it's ended up around 300 and something, so quite a huge number, showing that there's a real need to to test your soils, of course, and keep a check on where things are. But even in the compost one, it's quite interesting, because we can see we're putting large applications on, and we're getting it up to around 100 or so. So for the first one, it's fine. But then when we got that second compost, if you remember, the one that has the higher coal oil P, the higher chicken manure ingredients, 20% into the compost, it's really blown it out to about 200 in coal oil P, and then it's gradually declined over time using it. So it's and similarly so that's the full compost. Then the open one is the half rate, and it's sort of mirrored that trend as well. So it just goes to show that we have to also take the soil phosphorus levels into account because of off-site environmental effects, and look at the importance of soil testing, the importance of knowing the levels in your compost, especially extractable P levels, when you're considering how much you apply and in the system. So I guess as general conclusions for all this study is just to highlight the fertilizer value of the compost, and the the obvious that we all know, that the high organic carbon inputs are improving soil quality and function, and they've improved the chemistry of the soil, they've improved the physics, the infiltration and the structure and so forth, water holding capacity, the biology and the biological function, disease suppression, and these have resulted in soil quality benefits, and these soil quality benefits have resulted in yield benefits in some cases for certain responsive crops. And the other thing is that there's also risks to manage with compost, with certainly with we need to watch sort of heavy metal levels and pesticides, glass and things. So that's why it's important, I think, for compost standards and Australian standard and so forth, and to work in that area and work at getting these out of the system. So part of it, I guess, is public education in terms of the organics going into the collections, but also maybe systems of getting that, removing these materials, and also maybe looking at how we manage our organic waste in terms of, some very, very contaminated products might be better finding a different use, or whether, for example, you could use more biochar, high plastic green waste that are problematic, and deal with it that way. The economics, as I said, dependent on distance from supply, and because they're bulky, and we really need a yield response in a high value crop to cover the investment. And if you get that, then it is very economic, and especially for this peri-urban system, it would seem. So it's all about, I guess, obviously we're talking about recycling organics, and we're recycling the nutrients from that back into the food production system. So that's all good, something we should strive for. The other thing I was going to just finish with, I suppose, was conclusions, from this study in terms of ways forward, and how you might use the information from this for designing future work and looking at different things. And I was thinking it was very apparent in the study that a large application of compost, around 100 tonnes per hectare, for example, is important as a first step to transform the soil quality initially from a sort of a more standard farmer practice to a to a soil a system with a higher soil quality, and that large application actually paid for itself over those 5 crops. So that's an important first step. And then I think it's also important to monitor soil nutrient levels over time, of course, and also the compost nutrient levels, and take that into your consideration when deciding what compost to use, etc. Perhaps one strategy might be to have a large application initially when you go into such a system, and 120 tonnes per hectare to get it all going and get that sort of transformation in soil quality, and then maybe back off to like a medium 60 tonnes per hectare after 5 crops, as it had a good response the second time, if you remember, in the yield results. And then maybe after that look at some sort of application rate that tries to maintain organic carbon levels around that 2%, which seems to be important for some responses in some crops. I think looking at compost and minimum tillage systems on permanent beds is worth doing in terms of reducing the amount of tillage, and therefore the amount of extending, I guess, the length of time that you've got that organic carbon advantage there. Also look at combining compost with fertigation, so you're sort of looking at cycling the nutrients, but the inorganic nutrients, but with the compost in the system, so that it's a bit hungrier for nitrogen and cycling. Need to carefully monitor crops. I think the nitrogen status come out of this work, in that because the nitrogen supply doesn't go forever, and there's always a risk of nitrogen drawdown, etc. And I think it's important to maybe include something like a test strip or something where you do apply the inorganic nitrogen, and you can compare your alternate compost input system with that, and adjust your nitrogen according to how it's travelling through the crop. Yeah. I think peri-urban vegetable production in around any of these cities, for example, here it was Sydney, but has a lot of potential for compost, and I think the study has shown that it can be economic, especially if you choose the right crops, and that's probably the system to maximise your benefit and also be profitable. I think it's very important to now look at trying to evaluate crops and soil combinations for yield response to soil quality from such improvements. And so then we can find where there are winners and where it might be economical, and make help inform us for our decisions. And I think the other thing is that compost qualities are changing as well, so we need to take that into account as we move from garden organics, green waste bins, to then bringing food waste into it from household food waste, and how that'll be have a higher sort of nitrogen mineralisation. We just have to factor that into management, and so that I guess that was the that's the main points I was trying to make, and that I thought the field trial here at CROA by New South Wales DPI was had brought out a few sort of very interesting results that can help further refine systems and for the future, and I think peri-urban vegetable production is a good option for utilising the resource. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. That was really interesting, and I'm sure it helps fill lots of gaps in this area where this product is growing in terms of its usage and people's interest in it. So now, as I said earlier before Simon began his presentation, we have time for questions and comments, and thank you for those people who've already put their questions into the question pane. So I'll start with them, if you like. Louise Edmonds has a few sort of technical questions about what you did actually, Simon. She wanted to know to what depth you sampled.
Mm-hmm. All right. With the soil sampling, we sampled to just to 15 centimeters. That was the standard sampling practice. So we'd normally get about I think it was 7 cores, sort of 5 centimeter diameter, and we'd bulk it together and so forth. And what we'd do is we'd basically divide it up into for the various analysis. So we'd have sort of the soil biology stuff, the stuff we'd send off for nematodes, and we'd do the physics and chemistry. So we sort of split the sample that way. But yeah, that's how we.
Okay.
That was our depth.
Thank you. Go on to Louise's next question was about what carbon fractions you measured, if any, in that suite of testing that you were doing.
All right. Well, I guess generally we for most of it we do total organic carbon. We do microbial biomass carbon, and what I have done as well is that for the beginning samples from the start, and then at the end of the end of the 5 crops before, and then from crop 6 and crop 10, I've got particulate organic carbon and less, I suppose, but it's sort of sitting in a file somewhere. But for all these ones though, we're just looking at 0 to 15 centimeters total organic carbon, I suppose. So leco-combustion and that's humus combustion, yeah. So and we'd always do the microbial biomass.
Yeah. So the total organic carbon is something you would often see in an ordinary run-of-the-mill soil test.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's just in most cases you could just do it's just total carbon is the same. It's only if you got inorganics in there you'd adjust it. Yeah, yep. So they can do that.
Okay, and then Vicky Bruns asked, did you use any particular vegetable matter as a standard compost, or did you base the composts on exactly the same ratio of NPK in each application, which I think would have been difficult to replicate, which is true. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, all we did was I think at the very beginning sourced a supplier, and that was typical of what was being supplied to the vegetable growers around Western Sydney, and it was we just made sure that it was I think a green waste compost, garden organics compost with a small amount of chicken manure in it, so a blended compost is that. And then when we went for the second, we just went back to the same supplier again, hoping to get an identical one to the first, but it looked like he'd increased his blend a bit of chicken manure, going by our analysis. But we're mainly just trying to get a compost that had a lot of mostly garden organics in it, and stick to it. Yeah, that was the main thing. I think at the beginning, before the field trial, Yin Chan did a pot trial of a lot of composts from around Sydney suppliers, and that sort of revealed, I guess, the ones that were probably going to be problematic for end drawdown and stuff like that. So there was a filtering process as well. Yeah.
I think that highlights a really important point that, unlike fertilizer, they're not sort of like a standard product as such, and it's really important that you know all that you can about any kind of compost that you are going to apply, and in fact, a bit like biochar, that you're using the right kind of compost to address the issue that you want it to.
I think if you can at least try to adhere, if you can get a Australian standard or something like that, that's at least gives you some comfort in terms of contaminants and stuff. But like you say, the problem with composts has always been the variability and from batch to batch and stuff like that. So that's something that has to be sort of managed. I guess we're looking at ways of doing a rapid assessment of that for various things, but that's still getting developed. But in the meantime, I think if you can get an analysis of your compost and you know, have these strategies in place, because the main thing will, and if you get the Australian standard, you'll get lower contaminants. You eliminate most of that risk, but if you have an analysis which you can ask for, then you've got something to go on, and a strategy with managing nitrogen, like I mentioned, you know, sort of some sort of sap testing and so forth of your crops or plant testing, just to keep a check on, if you have to add something.
Yeah, that's good advice. Louise Edmonds has also asked another question about whether, actually there are a few questions I think, about whether the used standard cultivation techniques like rotary hose and things. That you did, didn't you? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So we used the standard rotary hoeing sort of incorporate all these things and form the beds up and so forth. Probably the only difference here was that because of the nature of it, we used a hand-operated sort of rotary hoe setup rather than rather than a bigger tractor setup. But it was following the same protocol as farmer practice. That's what we're trying to mimic.
Yep. And Vicky Brunn's also got another question which is really interesting. She wonders why farmers aren't using their waste to create their own compost, and is it partly that there's a risk of spreading disease if they use their own waste to create compost and reuse it on crops?
Well, I think they'll find if they turned it into compost or whatever, then they would minimise the disease risk, because if they do the composting properly, they sort of pasteurise the product, so you're killing any pests and so forth. So it's probably a good way to limit disease. What we did was just incorporate it, but it depends on your system, I guess. If you were in this high tillage system incorporating, you'd probably just incorporate your residues and only think about the composting if there was a disease sort of issue, but then you've got it as an option. But maybe in, you know, a minimum tillage type setup, you know, like a permanent bed type thing, if you didn't want to do the tillage for as much incorporation, you know, collecting the residues and composting might be a good option.
I think also the thing that Simon talks about with the pasteurisation means that the compost has to reach a certain temperature to kill the weeds and the pathogens. So to make that easy, you need a sort of a minimum bulk of material to get that hot. And maybe people don't have that. And then there's the other option, or the other thing, that perhaps not all growers have the confidence in their own abilities to be able to create a compost that's of good quality if they haven't done it before, that sort of stuff. But certainly it's something that, you know, seems like a good thing to get into.
Yeah.
Okay, Sue Beck has a question. She wanted to know what the pH of the trial soils were, and would it be different, or would the results be different on an acid soil in terms of the nitrogen and phosphorus application and surplus nutrients?
All right. Yeah. The pH of the soil at the beginning was so I'm flicking through pages now. It was 5.2, so it was an acid soil at the site. So if obviously pH would differ, if it, like, I think mainly if you had like, you know, if you had an alkaline soil or something, obviously you might get you might get more volatilisation and so forth. But also, so with the acid soils, I think if you can incorporate it quickly, then that you you reduce any losses that way. So yeah, it was a standard sort of hard setting acidic soil that we studied. It wasn't obviously there wasn't any it wasn't a problem soil, and that there wasn't any exchange of aluminium or anything like that. It was just it was above 5, but 5.2 still acidic. Yep.
So actually, did you want to hazard a guess about the soil type? Because Amanda Chappelle's actually asked what soil type the trial was on, and if you thought there were certain soil types that would benefit more from compost application.
All right. Yeah, I think we called it a curacao type soil, but it was sort of varied in terms of going from gradational profile and texture to a more texture contrast across there's a slight variation there, but yeah, it was pretty hard setting, low organic carbon level, maybe 1% or something, and acidic. So it's definitely benefit from organic carbon. It had a long history of cultivation, so I think any soils that are that have structural problems are going to benefit. Certainly, in terms of the water holding capacity, sandier soils will definitely you'll get additional benefits there from those. But it's definitely worthwhile considering there. And any hard setting, medium textured soils.
And
probably.
Sorry. Oh, and presumably any soil that has a lower soil organic carbon level.
Yeah, that's right. So if everything was, if you just come off, a few years of pasture and it was high organic and it was in good condition, you probably you wouldn't waste your time on it. But if it's had a long history of cropping and it's low organic carbon and has a lot of room to improve its soil quality for growing a crop, that's where you'd do it. But so that's part of the story, as well in the selection, as well as those other aspects. So given the lean towards horticulture, I suppose any site that has a reasonable drainage and is suitable to horticulture are other aspects, and then location to compost supplier for the economic side of it. Yeah.
Okay, then there's a different question from Jeff Clark, who said he understood that you said you would not plant lettuce as the first crop. Could you explain why you said that?
I was just thinking because it's typically a bit more sensitive to salinity levels in the soil. So I was thinking any crops that have any that are more less salt tolerant, that are more susceptible to salinity. So when you first put a lot of compost in, there's a reasonable electrical conductivity, a reasonable salinity level. But most crops are fine. But the very sensitive ones, you might worry about. So I'd probably, that's what I'm thinking, is you just be a bit more cautious for the first crop following the initial big application, just because there's a bit of salt associated with it.
Okay. Simon Humphreys has asked what prices you were using for the industry per tonne to give you your benefit cost ratio rates.
All right. Yes. I'll have a look. I think it was about. What was it? I think it was. I've got down here around around $34 a cubic meter was the cost. Yeah, $34. So it was, and then actually that was an interesting thing. Was that part of this was a break-even cost was something. So there was something called a break-even cost, which was quite high. It was like it was about $120 cubic meter or something. So just from that response, they worked that out as well. Yeah. So that's what I've got in front of me for it's about 34 bucks a cubic meter. I think that's yeah, yep.
Okay.
So what we used was we used the actual costs that we had from the field trial to get the compost there, and then they factor in a cost for spreading and stuff as a farmer budget. Yeah. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you. There's a question here from John Galea who says, were crop residues worked back into the soil after each crop, or were they totally removed? Because he wanted to know whether the residues would be adding organic matter as well.
Yes, yeah. So that's part of the story here. Is we've incorporated the residues each crop. So it's not it's not a pure compost degradation over time. It's a system change over time, and part of that system was incorporating the residues. So yeah, he's right. And it was interesting in that some residues, for example, after cabbage, had a noted effect on cation exchange capacity and other soil quality properties. So there's relating to the quality of the residue. Yeah. So
Okay.
that was part of it. Yep.
All right. Vicky Bruns also asked another question, but there's a misconception, I think, which would be good to clear up around nitrogen drawdown. She said, if adding nitrogen to your soil creates nitrogen drawdown, what can you do to counter this reaction? My understanding is it's excess carbon that creates the nitrogen drawdown. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So I think that's the thing, is that if there's an excess of especially a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, so there's a lot of substrate for the microbes to consume, and in that process they're taking in the available nitrogen in the soil. So with some of these with the composts that have a high C/N ratio and from the more woody material versus a sort of a blended compost slightly lower, with the blended compost here, there's a provision of mineralization of nitrogen, so it's supplying a fair bit of mineral nitrogen to counter that consumption by the microbes. But when there's notably more carbon substrate there, I think the build-up in the population of soil microbes that are consuming that are also taking, so it's related to carbon. Substrate.
Okay. Michael Fitzgerald here has asked if you could elaborate on how the 10% nitrogen mineralization rate was calculated.
Yeah, so that was just taken from the literature, really. So just from some incubation study. There was a study by Evanylo, Evanylo, and Sharoni, 2002. But I think they did and also if you look at, I guess, a lot of the literature seems to suggest around 10%, and the incubations I did later myself were around that figure for these sort of products. So it's based on sort of incubation studies, basically. But
okay. Vicky would like to know why the soil testing was only done to 15 centimetres when plant roots go down a lot deeper. So I don't know if you would like to answer that.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's just the standard depth that they use for industry, and usually a lot of their recommendations for fertiliser applications relate to that sort of sampling depth. So it sort of links into response studies and so forth. So that's sort of how I think they end up sticking to that depth, because you can't keep changing it for every crop's a bit different as well, I suppose. But so it's really an arbitrary level that they've decided on as for all of that work, and then this sort of links into that. Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
That's the.
Yep. Okay. Let me just have one final look. I think that's all. We've had a nice bit of discussion, which is great. Thank you everyone for participating and asking all your questions. And thank you very much to Simon for presenting. As I said, I think it's a growing area of interest, compost and how it can be used, and with all our war on food waste and all that sort of stuff. So thank you very much. Thank you all you guys for attending, and I hope to see you next month. So look out for your invitation for that if you're a subscriber.